Hi, this is Common Ground, and I'm your host, Sonja Wolf. With me today is Dr. Karina García Reyes. She's a criminologist currently working at the University of the West of England in the United Kingdom. And she is with me today to talk about the social roots of criminal violence in Mexico. Karina has done research on criminal violence in Mexico. She has spoken to young men who have worked in criminal groups in Mexico. And we're here today to take a look at the perpetrators. So first of all, welcome, Karina.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me.
Thanks for being here. And so at the beginning, perhaps it's worth remembering what is happening in Mexico. Since late 2016, Mexico has been the site of a war against drug trafficking. This conflict pitches the security forces against the country's many criminal groups. And while both sides commit violence, the criminal groups are known for committing particularly gruesome acts of violence. So in this episode, we're going to take a closer look at the perpetrators, specifically at ex-narcos or former members of drug trafficking groups. Karina, you have published a book in Spanish. It is called Morir es un alivio, or When Dying is a Relief. Perhaps to get us started, if you could tell us a little bit about the research you have conducted.
Right. So I started this research when I started my PhD, and my research question, or actually my personal interest in this topic, started with this key question of how is it possible, as you just said, violence in Mexico is becoming so gruesome, so unspeakable, that personally, as a Mexican, I just wanted to understand how is this possible. So in order to answer that question, I thought, let's ask the perpetrators. More than just listening to the same discourse over and over from the Mexican and the American authorities, I really wanted to know from their perspective, how did they understand violence? So to do this, I conducted a 4-month fieldwork in my hometown in the north of Mexico, in a rehabilitation center where I spoke to several former drug traffickers, and officially I interviewed 33. So what I did was to talk to them about their lives. I conducted life story interviews, and that was more enriching, to be honest, that I thought, in order precisely to understand and answer that question, how is this possible, how they became violent.
So at the beginning, you just mentioned you interviewed former members of criminal groups. Later on, we will get to a little bit more to the activities that these young men were involved in. But could you tell us a little bit about these young men you spoke to? In your book, you call them ex-narcos. Perhaps this is a shorthand you can keep using in this podcast. But tell us a little bit about who these young men are.
Well, most of them came from poor or extremely poor backgrounds. The youngest I interviewed was 19 at the time of the interview, and the oldest I think was 40, 41. Most of them engaged in drug trafficking violence when they were young. The youngest one I interviewed, the 19, and actually I think I included his case in the book, I think he's Travis, in the book. So yeah, they were very young, most of them, when they joined the drug trafficking organizations. As I said, they were coming, most of them, from poor backgrounds, Most of them didn't finish secondary school. Most of them barely finished primary school. So hopefully that gave you an idea of the socio-demographic profile.
Sure. A little later on, I would like to go a bit more and in greater detail into the socioeconomic circumstances of these young men. But before we get there, could you perhaps describe a little the activities that these young men were involved in? Because I think when often when we hear about the criminal groups and when we look at newspaper headlines, people will see references to the so-called drug lords or higher ranking drug traffickers. But could you tell us, is this really the majority of drug traffickers or individuals who are involved in criminal groups? Could you tell us a little bit more about the people who are doing the work for those criminal groups, and what kind of activities are they involved in?
A very good question. And actually, I think something interesting, I would say a myth coming from probably movies and series, is that there are specific or fixed rules. According to my research, that's not really the case, because, for example, some of my participants started as drug dealers in the streets. They were users first, and then they became part of, that illegal business. And eventually, one way or another, they ended up working as, let's say, as a bodyguard, or some of them, would have different tasks. And one of them would be like a sicario, basically. But we know as a sicario. But their job was not only that, you know what I mean? For example, one of them, well, actually, some of them, for example, worked as drug dealers, but also helped individuals higher in the organization when collecting debts, right? So that included things like torturing people, disappearing people, and even the logistical, aspects of it is something that I found interesting, in the sense that this is a business, right? So, for example, one of them was not only a drug dealer involved in torture and disappearing bodies, but also the driver, for example, of the truck where they put all the bodies. They used to drive, at the outskirts of the city in a ranch. They would disappear the bodies. So that would be, some of them would have this kind of mixed activities. Some of them, for example, also engage in human trafficking. So they were again, it was mixed, migrant smuggling, human trafficking, because most of my participants worked on the border, right? On the border states, Coahuila, Sonora, Chihuahua, Tamaulipas. So some of them were what we call polleros. So they used to help people to cross the border. And again, they kind of took advantage of these routes, not only to smuggle drugs, but also people. And then once there, some of them engage in human trafficking, some of the girls and women that actually pay them to help them to cross border. Unfortunately, they were victims of human trafficking. So yeah, different roles in terms of drug dealing, in terms of torture, kidnapping. Two of them actually were kind of middle rank, and they said that it was, one of them is, he was the oldest that I interviewed, and the other one was very young, but he was very close to what he called the comandante in the organization. But clearly they said, it's this kind of level of drug traffickers. There are not many of them because either they're very discreet and people will never know, or they get killed, or they go to prison.
You mentioned that many of these young men who end up working for drug trafficking groups come from impoverished backgrounds. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the circumstances of these young men before they end up joining a drug trafficking group. If you could perhaps give us a sense of the neighborhoods or the just the homes that these young men come from, and how this influenced ultimately their decision to work for one of those groups.
Oh, thank you for asking that question, because this is something I tried to do with my book, Morir, alivio, to present the readers, the Mexicans in general, their life stories, because these individuals are not born being narcos or criminals. So in terms of the socioeconomic conditions, most of them, as I said, they were poor. And what does that mean? They meant, unfortunately, not only they lacked resources, material resources, but also attention. They were, unfortunately, victims of neglect, child abuse, physical abuse, definitely psychological abuse. One of them, unfortunately, as I said, he had to live in the streets since he remembered. So he was kind of going from neighbor's house to a neighbor's house, ended up at DIF. I don't know what to call it in English, the kind of child services department, was on his case several times, but at the end they brought him back to the streets. So as you can imagine, very difficult circumstance. The others, for example, did have they did have a family, but their own parents, their own mothers, their own fathers were the ones abusing them, especially the fathers. And this is something I discuss a lot in the book, that one of their biggest sorrows is, these memories of their fathers beating their moms. Not how, I was surprised that they didn't actually they were not angry at them for being abusive towards them, but rather towards their mothers. And they were so exposed, and this is something that honestly shocked me a lot, was the level of exposure to different types of violence since early age. Listening to the stories, like violence everywhere, like inside our home, domestic violence, then in the streets, street gangs. So they grew up, as they said, in the jungle, within this jungle, meaning the poor neighborhoods. They learned to be violent. So they were bullied, they were abused as well, by the older kids. And in order to survive, they had to kind of become as violent and more than these kids. And you can see how they started becoming violent in order just to survive, and lacking all sorts of protections, like not protections at home, not protection in the school. Many of them actually were expelled from public schools because of their violent behavior. Some of them said that the psychologists in the schools tried to help them, but they were so violent that they had to expel them. So they were pretty much abandoned by the state through the public school. They were mistreated by their own families, and they found some sort of support in the gang. So as they grew, they started to be part of a string gang, a pandilla, and they referred to that as the only group that supported them, the only place, the only space that they felt some sort of like a safe. And also, the gangs, they were introduced to legal and illegal drugs in order to forget about the pain, physical pain, but also emotional pain from, feeling that they were disposable. All of them told me, no exception, that they thought that they would die young because that's what they saw in the neighborhood. They would die either from an overdose or killed by a bullet or in a street gunfight. So they saw life as pointless. They saw themselves as not relevant, as nobodies, as they said, with no future. So all of these elements combined later, when we, came to the point of, when they joined the drug trafficking organizations, then makes sense. And the title of the book, Morir es un alivio, dying is a relief, I think condenses their life ethos very well. Life is unbearable. And this is something that I would ask the people listening to us. When you listen to their stories, and by the way, by these, I'm not suggesting to justify their actions by any means. But when we listen to the stories, something I did as a researcher, and I found very helpful, is to distance myself, to move away from my own life, my own privilege, my own ideas and values, and understand the world from their perspective. When you have no support, literally one of them told me, I didn't know how to use cutlery until I got to the rehab center because nobody taught him. He grew up in the streets. So little details like these, which perhaps seem silly, show you that how can they know the difference between good and bad if literally nobody told them that difference?
It sounds like for the individuals you spoke to for your research, there were not really safe places, neither in the home, nor at school, nor in the community. And all this exposure to chronic violence meant, in the sense that they became habituated, accustomed to violence. And this normalization of violence probably played a role later on when they worked for the criminal groups. Perhaps if we could just add a little to what you just said, because if we remember in Mexico, there are high levels of poverty, of marginality, and the neglect or the abuse, also the gender violence that you encountered in your research is very widespread in Mexico. So people listening to this podcast might say, well, but if poverty and violence are so widespread, why is it that some individuals end up working for criminal groups and many others do not? So could you perhaps speak a little bit about the impact that this exposure to marginalization and violence has had on these young men, the pain and the hurt it caused them at a young age?
Sure. Again, and I think that's a really good point that you're raising, saying that poverty doesn't equal criminality. And I think we should make that very clear. And something I say in the book precisely is that poverty, what it does is, let's say, enhances the chances of young people and children to engage in crime. Why? Because, for example, in the case of my participants, they lived in very marginalized areas where literally, as they said, not even the police would enter. They were on their own. Okay. So in this sense, imagine the high levels of insecurity, right? So, at these levels, there's several types of of crimes, petty crime, street gangs, fights is something that again I was shocked when I was doing the interviews. Not that I didn't know about them, but something I didn't know was how cruel they were and how prevalent they are in these areas, in these poor neighborhoods. Like, the street, before we got to the part where they talk about their roles in drug trafficking, they talk a lot about street gang fights and how they would fight with, knives, sticks, things, bricks, like they would harm each other so badly, like on a regular basis, you know what I mean? Like every weekend, fighting for the territory in these, poor neighborhoods, where you have several young kids and young people in these gangs. For some reason, they have this sense of appropriation of their territories, and they have these mini turf wars in these neighborhoods. And as I said, they engage in these violent fights in ways that I would have never believed. For example, one of them told me about a fight where they used to literally torture the other kids. They would kill them, literally kill them or leave them in a coma, or I don't know if this is the word, maim them, like kind of amputate limbs or take it. One of them actually ended up in the military because in a street gang fight, they took, I don't know what to call it, like with a stick, they took an eye out of, another kid, and the police was looking for them. And where did they go to hide? To the military. So, this, imagine the sense of insecurity in these neighborhoods. And something again that I try to do in the book and in my research is to kind of understand what poverty means and what, in this context, it means to being exposed to this type of violence, but also because of all the things I already spoke about, being exposed to so many types of violence, your own father beating you every time. They actually gave me a lot of details about what their father used to do to them. Like they used to tie them with, chains in the bed, by the bed, burn their hands on purpose. Things that you would never believe that parents can do to their children. And again, this is their parents. So all of these, again, add to the level, to the sense of feeling that they're not protected by anybody, and they have to become violent in order to, as violent or more than those who are mistreating them. All of them, parents, other adults, street gangs that are threatening them. So yes, in I think all of these factors combined hopefully can give us that picture of, imagine this on an everyday basis. Your everyday is constant fear for your life, literally. And that is something that I was able to have a sense of when I spoke to them, and that I would have never had by any other means. And they actually transmitted that fear that, because most of the fathers were alcoholic or drug addicts, and they were so scared in the night when their fathers came back, because they wouldn't know what they would do to them and their moms. And, all of this sense of being so helpless, plus the sense that not even to think about it, but the society, the police, that's not in the world. Actually, it's the opposite, because later in the narratives, I learned about the police as more than a protector, like a corrupt force that they could buy. So, sorry, I'm going to leave it there, but hopefully I replied to your answer.
Could you take us a little bit into the homes of the families? Because you mentioned already that there was neglect, that there was child abuse, and I was hoping to hear from you a little bit more about the dynamics in the family's homes, and if you could perhaps focus for a moment on the figure of the father. So you mentioned, for example, that some of the fathers were alcoholics, and there seemed to have been a climate of fear in the family's homes. So could you tell us a little bit about the role of violence within families, within the homes, especially as it relates to men, and what this meant for your research participants as they were growing up?
Yeah, sure. So violence for them literally means being masculine, or being a true man, as they say. Un hombre verdadero means being violent. And that was taught by their fathers or their masculine figures. And for example, one of them, his father was in the military, by the way, and he was very, very aggressive, very violent with the whole family, with him and his sister and his mother. And the way that he treated him, he said, like, again, there was no sense of protection. It was more punishment, teaching him by punishing him. And this idea of, one way or another, all of them were taught the same thing. You know, in order to be a man, you have to be aggressive. In order to be a proper man, you need to be respected by the others, and be respected by the others meant that people were afraid of them. And how are they going to be afraid of you? If you demonstrate your physical strength. So, for example, in this case, this father used to educate his son by physical punishment, and by, whenever he questioned his dad about it, or questioning his dad about beating his mom up, he used to tell him, this is how the world works. Learn. Literally, beating his mom up. He was trying to defend her, and the father said, no, this is how it works. So this is very explicit, but in other life story cases, it's very similar. The fathers kind of, the violence is just not there, but also taught. You know what I mean? Like verbally, for example, all of them agreed that their parents, their fathers, used to tell them that if they had a fight with other kids, they had to win. And if they didn't win in that fight, they would beat them up. Or if they run away from that fight, I was impressed that all of them said this, exactly the same thing that their dad said. If you run away, if you are seen as a coward, then the beating up that they didn't give it to you, I'll give it to you. So again, it was a process of indoctrination, both verbally, but also by everyday violence. And another case, for example, the participant's dad was kind of one of the leaders of a street gang, which I didn't understand because I didn't know that they were. I mean, I imagine that the dad was not that. young, but he said that he somehow kind of was the leader of that street gang and other gangs that later become part of a criminal organization. So again, that was very violent, and he used to, again, every day would, what they all agree was that the fathers would look for any excuse to beat them up. Them and their mothers, especially when drunk, right? Again, the experiences of violence are so similar and in varied ways. Like one of the, as I said, the fathers were in one case military, part of the military. Another one was a policeman again. And I think I included that case. I forgot the name I assigned to this case, but again, it was I was very heartbroken because they were very poor, and this man used to enjoy mistreating him, my participant, and his siblings and the mother. Because of his father's beating, the mother had several miscarriages. They would starve, literally starve. The dad would come home and eat in front of them while they were starving. Things like this, that is not necessarily physical violence, but, it's definitely psychological violence. So again, I would invite the people listening to us, and especially if they have read the book, to think about these experiences again on an everyday basis. As one of them told me, it was a constant nightmare that you never wake up. And that's how that's why they start doing drugs, because life from very early age, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, they don't know what to do. They don't know where to go. So what they do is, because other kids in the neighborhood, older usually, say, look, this can help you to forget. This can help you to, endure the situation. And that's how they grow up. You know what I mean? Violence within, violence outside, and with this idea that in order to be regarded as a true man, you have to be violent. Interestingly, they acknowledge that they are not born violent. They do not say, actually, they acknowledge that they used to cry a lot, that they were always afraid, they didn't want to be part of the street gangs, but they had to in order to survive.
These everyday experiences of marginalization, of violence, what role did they play ultimately in the decision to start working for a criminal group? And in the case of poverty, for example, would you say that only the poorest individuals end up joining a criminal group, or what role does poverty, or perhaps the ambition to leave poverty behind, to be someone, play in this decision?
Okay, again, this is something that I learned from this research, because before I started, I actually believed that, poverty precisely was one of the key elements, pushing people to be part of criminal organizations. In the case of my participants, and I need to do this to clarify this is in the north of Mexico, urban areas, right? I'm not saying all of them, but in the case of my participants, even though they were poor and extremely poor, none of them told me they engaged in crime because they were poor. None of them, including the ones that were literally starving as children, none of them said, oh, I did it because I was forced, or I did it because I didn't have any other means to feed my family. So this is where I include this concept that I found very helpful of relative deprivation, meaning that they were comparing themselves with other people in the society. They wanted luxury items, right? They just didn't want to survive because eventually they found ways to earn money from very young age. You know, in Mexico it's quite common, you know, selling things by the traffic lights, doing different things as builders, painters. They said they had good money to survive, but they wanted more. They wanted good clothes, good cars. They wanted what most of them saw as the life they deserved, but they couldn't have because they had no education, because there was no way that through legal means they would have that type of life. So according to, and I say, in my research in this particular context, poverty as such was not something that participants saw as a reason to join the criminal organizations. What they did say, most of them, is that they wanted to live the best life they could because they wanted to die young. Again, this is where knowing all the context that we've been discussing is so helpful, because by 10, 12, 14 years old, these individuals are tired. And, you know, so when I hear about this concept of resilience, of how these individuals are so resilient to or normalize violence, yes, it's true, they see it as normal. But then I question how resilient they are, because they do have a limit of, I don't want to exist anymore. And as they said, they saw themselves as cowards because they were not able to commit suicide, even though they attempted sometimes to do it. So what they did was to kind of put themselves at risk. So, for example, joining these criminal organizations, they said, if they kill me, even better. So by joining the criminal organizations, especially at that point, kind of beginning of the war on drugs, 2008, 7, they thought, I'm going to earn a lot of money, enjoy, you know, my life as much as possible, and die young. I don't want to live forever. And it's this combination of, I have nothing to lose, this idea that my life has no meaning. I don't see the point of living. Nobody cares about me. My family is not there, even though most of them at a very young age, they already had kids, actually. They didn't care about that. They didn't care about their partners or their families. They just wanted to have things, you know, houses, cars, etc. So if you ask me, one of the main factors for them to be to engage in drug trafficking organizations or the criminal life itself was just having money for pleasure. And because they had already the training, you know, this violent training, they had some sort of kind of competitive advantage, so to speak, for criminal organizations. So they took advantage of it.
I would also like to come back a little to the idea of the father figure. Given that that these young men had experienced so much abuse and violence at home, often at the hands of their fathers, in what ways might this experience, this resentment that these young men must have felt towards their fathers, to what extent did that play a role in their decision to become involved in a criminal life, but also at the same time, did it make them perhaps look for a father figure within the criminal groups?
I wouldn't say that all of them, but definitely was something I noticed, that they were looking for a paternal figure. Yes. Actually, some of them were recruited by middle rank criminals or narcos. and they were kind of their proteges, so to speak. They met them either as clients, they were buying drugs, or they were these classic boys washing their cars. And, when they realized they had no family, that they lived in the streets, they kind of invited them to be part of, the organization, and they kind of adopted them. And in a couple of cases, actually, these two boys grew up thinking that man who the men who adopted them, were their saviors, and they were very loyal to them and their criminal organizations, but precisely because they were so grateful for being saved. And in the other cases, for example, I wouldn't say that the hate against their fathers was the main motivation, but definitely for some of them, did have some sort of influence when joining the drug trafficking organizations. In two particular cases, my participant said that when they were torturing people, they used to think about their fathers. They used to kind of have this fantasy that they were actually torturing their fathers. Or when they kill people, they would fantasize with the idea of doing that to their fathers. Interestingly, all participants who one way or another had this fantasy and tried to do it, at the moment of doing it, they couldn't do it. They couldn't kill their fathers. But in one of the cases, for example, he asked him to leave the country, because at this point, this young man had a lot of power. So he said, I'm going to forget, I will leave you, but you have to leave the country. Otherwise, I'm going to kill you. So yes, I would say that in some cases, these very dysfunctional relationship with the father specifically kind of play a role in their engagement in crime.
By the time you spoke to these men, they were already in a rehabilitation center in the north of Mexico. What was their life like in the criminal groups? You mentioned that in many cases their work involved the exercise of violence. But how did these men learn the same exercise of violence in the criminal groups? Is there a culture of violence? Are there certain beliefs within the criminal groups that perhaps are being used to justify the exercise of violence? And something that we hear sometimes about, but perhaps it strikes us sometimes as folklore, the cult of same death, and we don't know that much about it. But when I read your book, I was quite struck by the relationship between these beliefs, or the cult of same death, and its relationship to the exercise of violence. And something that you brought up is also the disappearances. We know that the drug war in Mexico has had high levels of human costs, especially in terms of homicides and disappearances. And so this is something I was hoping you could tell us more about, the exercise of violence within criminal groups, but also how it relates to certain beliefs, how these are being used to justify violence.
Okay. Well, something I learned with my research is that different criminal groups have their own training. For example, some of them, I don't want to actually name them, but the largest, I would say, to actually train their people, like literally train them how to shoot, how to do their job, basically. Others don't actually, they don't give any training. They just give an order. You have to do this. You know how to do it. Okay, with your own means. Sometimes they are given guns. Sometimes they are given other type of equipment. One particular criminal organization in the north of Mexico, this group that was created by ex-military, in this particular group, they did have a very strong belief in the Holy Dead, and that was a constant in the interviews with the men who used to work in this criminal group, which I discussed in the book, and I found honestly quite disturbing, because this is not necessarily a cult to justify violence, but rather is a cult to give the members of this group some sort of sense of protection, right? So they would engage in literally human sacrifices to the Holy Dead in order to obtain favors from the saint. And one of those favors was to protect their lives. So again, very disturbing in the sense that they sometimes would kidnap innocent people, including babies, children, and random individuals. Not only, most of the victims were the members of rival criminal groups. But what I found even more disturbing was the fact that they would, kidnap people completely outside, including children and babies. And the reason why they did that, as one of them explained to me, is because the Holy Dead, and I'm quoting here, speaks to them. Bear in mind that while they do these rituals, they aren't robots, right? So to contextualize the situation and what they actually said, so they literally do, like they include ritualistic elements like candles. They draw like a pentagon or a star. I honestly don't remember, but they do actually kind of create environment, and then they engage in practices that I don't think there's a point of talking about here, but you can imagine literally human sacrifices, and sometimes they would kind of do things with the blood or with certain, with the hearts of the victims, and they would offer that to the Holy Dead in one way or another. And what I found quite intriguing is that the same people, the same participants who before in the interview told me that for them violence, torture, kidnapping was a business in a very cold way, the same individuals told me that when it came to these rituals, they felt helpless because they truly believed that this entity, the Holy Dead, was or would have, I don't know how to explain it, like this entity owned them, right? So they couldn't reject, they couldn't say no to the Holy Dead's requests. And when you ask them, well, how do you know what this entity wants? They say that the Holy Dead speaks to them, whatever that means. Regardless of, that kind of supernatural element, what I discuss in the book is crimes happen, and really gruesome crimes happen in the name of this entity, right? Unfortunately, I don't have statistics. I don't have any other element to support this, to provide further details. But as I said, in light of so many disappearances in Mexico, I think it would be good to explore that, line of research, because again, when I listen to these narratives of how they used to kidnap innocent people, I wonder if that was the case, specific cases in the past, is this something more prevalent? I honestly don't know, but I do know that these type of rituals happened, and it happened on a regular basis.
The men work for different criminal groups, and each of these groups is in conflict with another criminal group. There are disputes over territories, and of course there's also the conflict between the criminal groups and the security forces. So if this idea of having the best possible life was important to these individuals, was the life in the criminal groups actually what they expected, or how did it turn out for them? How did they start to feel during this time that they worked for the criminal groups?
Again, really good question. Thank you. Yes, all of them agreed that once in the criminal groups, life was even worse because they became paranoid. And they did have some, at the beginning when they had the money they wanted, they did actually spend it as they wanted, as opposed to what might think, you might think, okay, you invested in a house or, I don't know, in a business. They all agree that they spend it on drugs. They spend it on, trips, cars, and brand clothes, and as easy as the money got to them, as easy as they spent it. So they ended up being exactly in the same position. And what they all said was that even with a lot of money, it was really difficult to spend it at the end because they were not free. They could not enjoy their freedom because they were paranoid. They were always paranoid, thinking somebody's following me, or the police is around, a rival enemy is somewhere, hiding. So even though most of them, actually all of them, did drugs before joining the criminal organizations, once in the criminal organization, they became even more addicted. And that's how most of the cases, they had to, that was one of the main reasons why they left the criminal groups, because they became too addicted to drugs. And that's a rule in most of the criminal groups. You do not use your own product, at least not during office hours. And what they did was violate that rule. They became pretty much, a burden for the organization. So they had to leave, or they made them leave. Different stories, but the point is, they did not enjoy their life within the organizations. At the beginning, yes, but after a couple of months, the mental burden, like the way, like one of them told me, I didn't sleep at all. So I was chronically fatigued because I was not able to sleep. I had my gun next to me because every single noise, I thought it was somebody. So there was no quality of life at all.
Perhaps to wrap up this first episode, if you could perhaps elaborate a little bit on this final chapter of these men in the criminal groups. So in your book, you mentioned drug addiction. Some of them had suicidal thoughts. But what really is the turning point for these individuals? The moment when they say they want to step away from the criminal group and, well, in some cases, perhaps take their life, or perhaps reach out for an alternative to the criminal group. When is this point reached?
Well, some of them were kicked out from the criminal groups, and they ended up as living in the streets. And literally, people walking by would think they were crazy people because, they were so dirty, and they looked like they were not mentally well. So some of them ended up like that. Some of them were asked to leave. Some of them actually survived an attempt of murder. So because they were one of them, for example, was stealing cocaine. The penalty for that was death. The instruction was to kill him. It's a very long story, but the point is, he managed to survive, and he escaped. And the place he found to find, what do you call it, like como un escondite, like a hidden place. He found this rehab center, and so. The common thread here is addiction. They became extremely addicted to the point that physically and mentally they were really bad. They, as I said before, they did want to take their own lives, but they didn't have, and I quote, the strength, or they were not brave enough to do that. So, in some cases, family members took them to the rehab center. In other cases, they arrived there because they wanted just a place to sleep, and they actually ended up there because they were convinced to stay. So the turning point here was either drug addiction, or because they survived these murder attempts and they were running away from their own organizations.
Even when these men want to step away from the criminal groups, there still need to be opportunities for conventional lives. If we look a little bit at rehabilitation centers, what is the window of opportunity, in a sense, for these centers to reach out to these men and start a rehabilitation process?
Right. I spoke to a lot of, the rehab center staff, and one activity I believe is really, really effective is that these individuals, they go to different areas where they know there are a lot of men in this condition. For example, by abandoned houses in really poor areas, because in abandoned houses usually is when they gather and they do drugs, and sometimes they sleep there. Bus stations as well. There are certain, hotels, motels, like areas where usually you find this type of individuals, at least in their own experience, because the individuals or the men who get out, in this kind of with the task of, inviting people to come to this rehab center, they have been there themselves. So what they do is, because they have already been there, they go to the places that they know that they would probably, for example, in some local, in a local context, for example, there's popular train tracks, and around these train tracks there are different camps, so they go there. So you know what I mean? So they know, the men who are in that, in this, I don't want to call it job, in this, in the search of individuals who need rehabilitation. They're very strategic. And some of the participants who ended up there because they had this leaflet that they got at some point, either at the bus station, at the hotel where they were staying. And the stories you hear, again, are very similar. Like, they were at a very stressful time of their life, at a breaking point. They wanted to commit suicide, one of them, because he knew that the organization was going to kill him. He decided to kill himself by doing all the drugs he could. So he rented this hotel room, brought all the drugs, tried to kind of die from an overdose. Shockingly, he didn't. And when he was going out to kind of surrender and say, you know what, kill me now because, I don't have anything, there was this man with a leaflet from the rehab center saying, here, there is another way, there is a way to live without the pain, and so on and so on. So I think that's the window, or the opportunity, is actually being in these popular areas. And how do we recognize them? Well, talking to people who have been there already.
This was episode 1 of the social roots of criminal violence in Mexico. Our guest today was criminologist Karina García Reyes. This is Common Ground, and I'm Sonja Wolf. Join us for episode 2, when we're going to talk about rehabilitation centers in Mexico and how Mexico might find other responses to drugs and violence.